Hello and welcome back to Public Speaking and Presentations. Again, my name is Paul Kim with the Korea National Diplomatic Academy. Thank you for joining me for part 2 of these 3 videos regarding public speaking and presentations. Before we move on for today's or this video, I want to talk a little bit and review video 1. If you all remember, I gave 3 simple tips in terms of preparing for a public speaking engagement. Do you remember what they were? That's right. Tip number 1, have a plan. Tip number 2, don't memorize. Tip number 3, keep your presentation or speech short. Now, moving on what we did, we then talked about introducing ourselves, introducing the topic of our presentation, and some language and strategies in terms of starting the actual body of our speech or presentation. We'll pick up where we left off in video 1 with transitioning from each section of our presentation or speech, ending the speech with some strategies and language, and I think one of the biggest things for this video is how to manage a question and answer period. So let's go forward. Now, again, we talked about getting into the presentation. I'd like to start by talking a little bit about speaking anxiety, etc., etc., etc. Now we're going to let the audience know we're done with one section so they can anticipate the next. You can use language, for example, so that concludes what I wanted to share regarding self-introductions. Or, okay, I think that just about covers all I have for introducing the topic of the presentation. And finally, you could say something like, to sum up this section of the presentation, we talked about introducing ourselves, introducing the topic of the presentation, and starting the presentation. So now we've concluded one section, made it very clear to the audience. Let's transition into the next section. As I mentioned before, a natural transition like native speakers use is often a great way to transition. You can say something like, now, let's move on to the next section of today's presentation regarding questions and answers. Or, I'd like to now explain a little bit why we become very nervous when we speak in public. Next, I'd like to take a look at some strategies in managing our fear when we get on stage. Moving on, I'd like to share some pointers regarding a Q&A period. Right, let's continue with some additional tips regarding answering questions. This leads me to my next point, which is so-and-so, okay? And then I'd like to now look at or consider some of the benefits of introducing ourselves. And lastly, I'd like to turn our attention to the next section of the presentation, which is so-and-so. So now we've clearly told the audience we're done with this section, we smoothly transitioned into the next, and we're able to do that from each part of the presentation or speech. Let's look at some of the language and strategies that we want to use to clearly show again to the audience the presentation is done. We can use the transitions such as, I'd like to wrap up by highlighting the key points I discussed. I talked about A, B, and C. And if you notice, even for the little sections, I often do a small summary. I really recommend the repetition of your main points. It really helps the audience digest your information, and they're able to get much more benefit from your speech. You can use an example like, allow me to conclude by summarizing the main points of today. We talked about speech anxiety, managing it, and some other strategies and tips. So I hope I was able to give some valuable insights into why we should give a good introduction and why we should introduce the topic of the presentation. Or you can say something like, okay, to summarize the main points of my talk, I talked about A, B, and C. Now, of course, just like you did when you started your presentation or speech, you must thank the audience for taking time out of their busy schedules to watch you or to listen to you. And so you can really just do it by simply saying, that brings me to the end of my speech today. Thank you all for listening. Thank you all for listening. It was truly a pleasure to be here. Finally, I'd like to finish by thanking you all for listening. I'd like to end by thanking you all for coming here today. So again, we've concluded the speech, we've thanked our audience. Now we need to transition into our question and answer period, which again, I think you're going to find nearly every speech or presentation you give while you're working in a company or organization, you're going to have audience members that have questions regarding any of the information you shared. So, a couple things about this. First, we said again, that brings me to the end of today's presentation. Thank you for listening. Smoothly transition into it. I will now take some questions from the audience. Please raise your hands and I can call on you. Or you could say, I'd like to now take some time to answer your questions. Please raise your hands and I'll recognize you. And lastly, you can say, I'd be happy to field some questions at this point. Please raise your hands and I'll call on you. Now, I want to draw your attention to the asterisk here. I put the words a few, 5, etc. Because again, depending on your time limit, you're going to want to set a limit of the questions that you can take. So that again helps the audience know, okay, well, she's going to take 2 questions or he's going to take 5 questions. It's solely up to you again and depending on how much time you're given. Now, a couple of things about answering. So we've invited the audience to ask us questions, but now we have to answer. And on a side note, a lot of people actually fear the question and answer period more than they fear speaking in terms of the presentation, because a Q&A period cannot be scripted. You don't totally know what the audience is going to ask you, and therefore you don't know exactly how you're going to answer. Let me give you some really important strategies and tips to help you with this. First of all, what I recognize often when I see people who speak in public and they take a Q&A session, one of the biggest mistakes they make is they concentrate only on the person who asked the question. And when you do this, when you only respond to that person, you've lost all the other people in the audience. Whether or not it's 8 people in a boardroom or it's 200 people in an auditorium. So certainly recognize that person, acknowledge their question, but make sure you deliver the answer to everyone who is in attendance. The second mistake I see from a lot of speakers is that they're thinking so quickly, they don't totally listen to the question. And so my second tip is to paraphrase, clarify, or repeat the question to make sure you understand the question fully, and also to help the audience make sure that they've heard the question. Sometimes someone asks a question, they're not loud enough for everyone to hear. So let me give you some language that will help you do this. So in order to paraphrase, you can simply say, thank you. So, are you asking for further clarification on why we should overcome our speaking anxiety? That's an interesting question. If I hear you correctly, you are asking if we talk about introductions before an overview or after. Is that correct? Or finally, you can say, thank you for asking. The question is whether or not we should memorize our speech or we should work on an outline, correct? So let me draw your attention to 2 things here. First, the words in bold. Is that correct or correct? What we call these are tag questions. And what that allows for the person who asks the question, you can say, is that correct? They can either say yes or no. And if it's no, they can clarify, they can repeat to make sure you fully understand the question. The other point I want to talk about is this. That's an interesting question. Now, a lot of people, they get in the habit of saying, that's a good question. And I don't think it's totally bad, but I think really you should try to avoid it, because if 5 people ask questions and you say, that's a good question, but you don't say, that's a good question to someone else, they're thinking, well, why isn't my question good? On the other hand, if you say it to all of them, that's a good question. That's a great question. What a wonderful question. Superb question. You appear insincere. They say, well, you're saying every question's great. So instead of doing that, just stick with, that's an interesting question. Now, we've clarified the question. Let's get into our response. After we've answered the question, you're going to want to make sure that the person who asked the question, that they are satisfied with your answer. We can do this by simply saying, does that answer your question? Does that clear things up? I hope that answers your question, or really in a short way, does that make sense? Now again, the audience member can say one of two things. They can say yes, or they can say no. And that leads me to the next section in regards to strategy and language, and that's when they're not satisfied with your answer. And again, we typically have a limited amount of time. You don't want to spend all of your Q&A on one person's question. So you can use expressions such as, sorry, I didn't fully answer your question. I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards. Please come and find me. Or, in order to allow for other questions, please find me after I'm done and we can talk more about your question. And lastly, you can say, pardon me for not being clear with my answer. Please find me afterwards and we can discuss your question some more. And what I want to point out here is that many people think, oh, if they're not happy with my answer, I've failed. But that's not true. It's not a failure. It's actually a really good opportunity for you to meet with that person and perhaps create a network, perhaps improve your business relationship going forward. Now, there are times that we have a Q&A period that we just don't have the answer to that person's question, or we're not the right person to answer that question. And instead of lying and making something up to please that person, I really advise that you are honest. Use an expression such as, that's an interesting question, but really, I don't actually know off the top of my head. But I'll try to get back to you later with an answer. Again, you're creating an opportunity to build a business relationship. I'm afraid I'm unable to answer that at this moment. Perhaps I can get back to you later. I don't have the answer to that question at this time. Please find me afterwards and we can find a way I can get you that information. And again, I said, sometimes you're not the person to answer the question. You can say, unfortunately, I'm not the best person to answer that question. If you find me after this Q&A session, we can find a way my company, my organization can get that information to you. Again, turning a failure, what you think is a failure, into a positive opportunity to network. So thank you again for joining me in part 2 of public speaking and presentation. It's been my pleasure. I really hope you were able to get some information and strategy and languages that'll help you in terms of your future presentations. Please join me in part 3 where we're going to talk about how we deliver our message. We've talked about language and format and outlines. Part 3, we're going to talk about how we actually give that information to our audience. Thank you once again.